Hey, this is Brian from Evolve Flagstaff. I'm the physical therapist today. On this week's edition of Whiteboard Wednesday, we're going to be talking about a topic that I get asked about almost every day, and that's muscle tightness and stretching. So I often get asked, like, hey, this thing feels really tight, or I hurt my back, or something's going on. What stretches should I do to fix it? There's this kind of assumption in our culture that one, tight muscles always need to be stretched, and two, stretching it will solve most issues. And so that's unfortunately not the case because the body is really, really complex. So we're going to dig in today about why muscles feel tight, and then what we can do about it. And I'm going to try and convince you that stretching is one piece of the puzzle, but it's not the only piece. And there's often more important pieces that we should address other than just stretching. Okay? So the first reason that most people think muscles feel tight, the most common reason that people think, is because a muscle's short. And this makes sense. You know, if a muscle is short, if I stretch it out, I lengthen it. This is often the case with the hip flexors. So the hip flexors were maybe sitting a lot, and that feels like they're really short up front. And I get the leg behind me, I lengthen them, and so that will resolve those feelings of tightness. This sometimes can be the case, but I want to test it. So if you're feeling tension in a muscle, let's do an objective test. So for example, for the hip flexors, we can do what's called a Thomas test to test the length of your hip flexors. And if they're truly short, then yeah, we want to strengthen or stretch them. But if they're not truly short, which I often find is the case, then we got to dig deeper and figure out why. If they're not short, if there's not a structural problem to the hip flexor, what else could be causing it to feel really, really tight? Particularly for people who do a lot of yoga, often most women, if you can place your palms on the floor, that's usually a good general assessment of back, hips, shoulder mobility. Then oftentimes length is not your issue. There's something else going on. So if you're always stretching an area, we're probably not thinking it's truly short, and let's dig a little bit deeper. Okay, so some other causes of muscle tightness could be, second one is stress. So the stress response creates tension in the body. We evolve the stress response to deal with threats in our environment, and we need tension to potentially deal with that. So that causes people to come up on their toes, elevate their shoulders, they breathe into the chest, they come inward, you get some resting tension in the hip flexors to get ready to run, and then a lot of places where most people report tension or tightness, the shoulders, hip flexors, chest, calves, those areas have the resting tension all the time. And so stretching can kind of be helpful, but that doesn't necessarily get to the root cause of why you're so stressed out. Can we get you less stressed? And then maybe you won't have that cycle of tension in the first place. Okay, that's going to be kind of pattern today. So we're going to look at, stretching can sometimes be helpful, but if it's not the root cause, let's dig deeper. Number two is movement patterns. So if we move in a funny way, so for example, if I squat with a quad dominant pattern, my knees are dropping in, my shoulders are dropping forward, that might cause my hip flexors or my upper back to feel really tight, versus if I get a good hip hinge, things sink back behind me, then I'm not placing an altered or a weird load on some of those tissues, and they can move optimally. I'm not compressing them, and they're not going to feel as tight. So we can look at how somebody moves in the context of their recurrent muscle tension or tightness, and that can often give us some clues into why they're feeling a certain way. We can get them moving differently, and that tension can start to fade. Overuse, this can be another common one. If a muscle is working all the time, it's contracted all the time, then it's gonna feel tight. So if you squeeze your hand all day, you're gonna hold this all day, your finger muscles, your finger joints, your forearm, that's gonna start to feel really tight because it's working all the time. This is more complex in areas like the hips or the hamstrings or the shoulders, when we might not realize that that's what we're doing all day. So part of my job is to figure out, are you holding something, holding tension for a reason that we can unwind that a little bit so it doesn't have to work all the time. Sometimes this is given some joints some new stabilizing muscles, or again, new movement patterns, and then they don't have to work so hard all the time. An injury can certainly cause muscle tightness, so muscles can tighten up around an injured joint. If a nerve is injured, that nerve along its whole path can have altered signaling or neuroinflammation that can cause muscle tension around that nerve. Restricted and injured joints or swelling can cause muscle tightness. And in a lot of these cases, stretching is actually unhelpful. It might feel relieving in the moment, but actually exacerbate the issue long term. So that's certainly a case. If you're trying to stretch your way through an injury or a potential injury, man, we got to dig a little deeper. Let's go to the next one, weakness actually. So muscles that are weak or could be stronger often feel really tight. This goes back to that kind of overuse idea. If a muscle's working all the time, if it's working at its maximal capacity, all the muscle fibers are contracted. If it's doing that all the time, it's going to feel really tight. We can change how much it has to work, but also if we get it stronger, then it's not going to feel like it has to work as hard for your activities. So example is the hamstring. A lot of times hamstrings feel really tight, or a lot of times runners do, but a lot of runners don't strengthen their hamstring. We actually need like a near maximal contraction of the hamstring in the running gait cycle. And so if you're not strengthening your hamstrings, you're asking a whole ton of it when you just go out for a jog. And that can create some muscle tension. We get the hamstrings stronger, they don't feel as tight all the time. This is counterintuitive for most people. Most people kind of assume if they get a muscle stronger, it might feel tighter for some reason. I think the elbow is a good example of how that's not the case. Most people can straighten their elbow all the way unless they've had an injury at the elbow. We get the bicep stronger doing some bicep curls, you're still going to be able to straighten your elbow all the way. That bicep is still going to be able to lengthen. And so trust me, strengthening does not equal tightness, and a lot of times muscles that are stronger are better able to relax and are better able to function when they're fully extended, because it actually takes more muscle contractive force. It takes a greater amount of strength to work in an extended position. So if you're somebody who, like an aerialist or a dancer or a yogi that wants to move really well in extended joint positions and positions that look like stretching, strengthening will probably help you feel less tight there, okay? That's a complicated one, and we can dig in there more in the future if you have questions. So if you have questions about, shoot them to me in the comments. Static positions, certainly you're hanging out in one position all day, then yeah, it's going to feel good to move in a different position. Part of my job though is to game plan. Can we get more movement variability throughout your day so that way you don't feel like a block of wood at the end of your day? Can we get you moving more often, more earlier in the day, so that way you don't get to the end of the day and feel like you got to stretch everything out. Finally, compression. That can make muscles feel tight as well. Oftentimes this happens with the hamstrings too. We sit on them all day, and that can alter blood flow, alter our neurological perception of the muscle, the neural inputs to the muscle, and that can cause it to feel tight too. I think the hamstrings get hit with like a double dose of this, because oftentimes they're a little weaker, or we want to get them a little stronger for people, and then we sit on them all day, and then we stand up, and man, it feels like we got to stretch those darn things. But if we didn't compress them and we got them stronger, they would probably feel a little bit better. Okay, so those are some of the reasons why muscles can feel tight. There's a lot of them, and if you lost me somewhere in there, that's okay. The main takeaway is that it's complicated, and if you feel like an area is always tight, know that we should dig deeper. Stretching and tissue work are two ways that most people know we can relieve tension, because that gets an area moving or gets some blood flow to it. But those are often temporary fixes, because if I'm doing this all day, I stretch it out or do some massage and then go right back to doing this, it's always going to feel tight. So let's dig deeper. Some other solutions are to move, or to move in a new way, a way you've never moved before, or we're changing your movement patterns. We're teaching you how to hip hinge, teaching you how to use your shoulders in a new way with good overhead positioning. That can really, really change sensations of muscle tightness. We can strengthen a muscle that feels tight and also strengthen around it, so it's not the only one that has to work. This is often true in the hips, the hamstrings, the hip flexors. We strengthen those guys and get all of the players in the game, and then things feel a little less tight all the time. Finally, we can look at our stress. We can take deep breaths, we can de-stress. If we're less stressed, our body will feel the need to have less tension over time. Okay? And there actually is one more. If there is a joint or a nerve involved, we can mobilize that directly, often in a way that's more effective than stretching and safer than stretching. Okay? Thanks for staying with me on this one. Just know if you feel tight all the time, you can try a couple stretches, but if that doesn't help, let's dig deeper and try some new things. Thanks. We'll see you next week.